I touched him to see if he was real. Now I'm praying he's not, because if he is, then I'm already his prisoner. I didn't choose him. I didn't even know his name. One reckless touch tied my life to a man who doesn't make threats. He makes decisions. And once he decides you're his, there is no escape. The bass from the club still thrummed in the soles of my feet, a phantom heartbeat that refused to sync with the frantic rhythm in my chest. I had spent my entire life being the girl who took up space, the one who laughed too loud to drown out the silence of a lonely apartment in Seoul. But as I stood in the dim, amber-lit hallway, my hand felt like it was fused to the expensive silk of the stranger's sleeve. I had intended it to be a joke, a playful claim on the most handsome man I'd ever seen to impress my friends, but the air between us had turned liquid, heavy, and impossible to breathe. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply looked down at my fingers, his profile as sharp and unforgiving as a cliffside at night. Up close, the man I thought was a hired entertainer smelled of expensive sandalwood and something metallic that made the hair on my arms stand up. I felt the heat of his skin through the fabric, a silent warning that I had reached out and touched a live wire. "You're late for the party," I managed to tease, though my voice came out as a breathless shadow of its usual self. I tried to maintain the smirk, the mask of the carefree girl, but my eyes kept darting to the ink peeking out from beneath his cuff, a dark, intricate design that looked less like art and more like a brand. Min Hae-in finally turned his head. His eyes were dark, unreadable pools that seemed to swallow the neon light spilling from the doorway behind me. In that gaze, I didn't see the practiced charm of a performer. I saw a terrifying, absolute stillness. It was the look of a man who was used to the world stopping when he spoke, a man who didn't exist in the same reality of budgets and deadlines that I did. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of my own making. I wanted to pull my hand away, to laugh it off and run back to the safety of the tequila shots and the screaming bridesmaids, but my muscles wouldn't obey. Beneath the sudden, paralyzing fear, a traitorous spark of desire flared, a hunger for the gravity he exerted. He was an anchor in a world that always felt too light, too fleeting. I felt his presence wrap around me, a silent possessiveness that didn't need words to command. I realized then that the men standing like stone statues behind him weren't waiting for a music cue. They were watching the hallway with a lethal, predatory focus. I hadn't interrupted a dance. I had walked into the center of a kill zone and mistaken the executioner for a toy. "Do you have any idea whose blood you're standing in, Arya?" he whispered, his voice a low, melodic rasp that sent a shiver straight down my spine. He knew my name. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stripping away the last of my bravado. He hadn't just been standing there, he had been waiting. And by reaching out, by choosing him out of a crowd of thousands, I had handed him the leash. The power imbalance was so vast it felt like a physical weight, a crushing realization that my life had changed in the span of a single heartbeat. I had teased the devil, and now, looking at the dark intent in his eyes, I knew he was never going to let me go back to the girl I was a minute ago. The silence of Min Hae-in's private office was far heavier than the thumping bass of the club, a pressurized void that made my ears ring. He sat behind a desk of dark, polished wood, his presence expanding to fill every shadow of the room until I felt small, a stray moth caught in a velvet jar. He didn't look at me with anger. He looked at me with the terrifyingly cold curiosity of a man who had already dissected my entire life. On the screen of a sleek monitor, my own face stared back at me, a grainy surveillance still of my hand on his arm, a moment of drunken bravado captured from 3 different angles. He began to recite my history like a prayer for the dead. My job, my family in Oregon, my small apartment outside Denver, even the months I had been late on my rent. The sheer reach of his power made my stomach twist, a sickening realization that he had peeled back the layers of my existence in the time it took for me to sober up. "I didn't do anything," I whispered, my voice trembling against the weight of his stare, but he only leaned forward, the light catching the gold ring in his deep brown eyes. He told me that in his world, intent didn't matter, only optics did. By pulling him into that room, by undressing the untouchable king of Seoul in front of 30 witnesses, I had signaled to his enemies that he was capable of being reached. I was no longer a tourist. I was a good weakness, a target painted in neon by my own reckless hand. Beneath the rising panic, a darker, more confusing heat flared, a magnetic pull toward the man who was currently dismantling my freedom. He claimed he wasn't trapping me, but protecting me, yet as he rose from his chair, his massive frame eclipsing the city lights behind him, the distinction felt meaningless. He was a man who controlled danger, and now that control included the very air I breathed. He told me I would stay in a restricted suite until he decided it was safe, his voice a low, controlled rasp that made it clear this wasn't a request. I wanted to scream, to fight the golden cage he was building around me, but every time his eyes traced the line of my throat, my resolve buckled. I had reached for a performer and found a master, and as the door clicked shut, I realized I was no longer the one making the moves. The restricted suite felt less like a sanctuary and more like a sensory deprivation chamber designed to make me crave the very man who had imprisoned me. I paced the length of the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Las Vegas Strip below a shimmering sea of neon that I was no longer allowed to touch. Every time I looked out, I saw the glint, that faint, rhythmic flash of a lens from the building across the street that Hayen's security had warned me about. It wasn't just him watching me anymore. The rival group had their eyes on me too, documenting my every breath as if it were a tactical data point. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, feeling the vibration of a city that continued to move while I remained frozen in time. My phone buzzed incessantly with messages from friends asking if I was safe, but I couldn't tell them that I was trapped and protected by the same hand. The inner conflict was a slow-acting poison. I was furious at Hayen for stripping away my autonomy, yet my skin still burned where he had looked at me with that lethal, focused intensity. I found myself reorganizing my purse over and over just to keep my hands from shaking, a pathetic attempt to reclaim a life that felt increasingly small and fragile. I was the bait, a good weakness, draped in silk and hidden away in a golden cage because I had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. When the door finally hissed open, I didn't even have to turn to know it was him. The air in the room simply thickened, bowing to his authority. He walked toward me with that slow, controlled exhale that sounded more like a threat than a breath. I wanted to demand my freedom, to scream that I didn't need his protection. But as he stopped just inches behind me, the unspoken desire was a physical weight. I could feel the heat radiating from his chest, the same chest I had undressed with such reckless, drunken confidence. He didn't touch me, but his presence was an embrace, a silent promise that he was responsible for the danger he had brought into my life. I was terrified of the man who could control danger and people alike, yet I was more terrified of the silence that would follow if he ever truly let me go. The cold air biting off the Han River felt like a physical assault, a sharp contrast to the suffocating luxury of the penthouse. I was kneeling on the damp concrete of the pier, the zip ties cutting into my wrists as the shadows of men I didn't know paced around me, their whispers a jagged edge of rival group, politics I didn't understand. They looked at me as if I were a piece of meat, a good weakness to be bartered for territory or pride. I stared at the dark, swirling water, my heart a frantic bird hitting the cage of my ribs, until the sound of a high-performance engine tore through the silence. Then came the slow, controlled exhale of a man who didn't fear the dark, because he owned it. Min Hayen didn't emerge from his black sedan like a savior. He stepped out like an inevitable catastrophe. He wore his lethal authority like a second skin, his eyes scanning the pier with a focused, unreadable intensity that made the kidnappers hesitate. There was no briefcase of money, no diplomatic plea. There was only the terrifying, absolute stillness of a man who had already decided how many lives were ending tonight. My stomach flipped, not just from the fear of the guns pointed at my head, but from the way Hayen looked at me not as a victim, but as a target he was claiming for himself. "Touch what is mine, and I'll bury you all," he whispered, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried over the wind. The possessiveness in his tone was a golden cage in itself. I was terrified of the violence he represented, the way he controls danger with a flick of his wrist, yet I found myself leaning toward him, desperate for the gravity of his protection. As the first shot rang out, I realized that I wasn't just afraid of the rivals. I was afraid of the part of me that wanted to belong to the man who would never let go. He moved toward me through the chaos, his jaw sharp, and his eyes a deep, unreadable brown. And for a second, the world fell away until there was only his strong, defined presence and the terrifying realization that I was no longer an accident. I was his destiny. The mountain estate was a tomb of glass and cedar, a fortress of silk that smelled of rain and Hayen's signature sandalwood. As the heavy gates hissed shut behind us, I felt the golden cage finalize its lock. He didn't lead me to a room. He marched me toward a fireplace that roared with a heat that couldn't touch the lethal stillness radiating from his frame. I stood in the center of the vast, minimalist hall, my damp clothes clinging to me, my defiant spirit warring with the terrifying, absolute stillness of the man standing by the window. He looked out at the dark tree line, his jaw sharp, and his eyes a deep, unreadable brown as he watched for threats I couldn't even name. The silence between us was a physical weight, a pressurized void that made my skin hum with a strange awareness I didn't want to admit. I wanted to scream at him for treating me like mafia property, for investigating my soul and stripping away my autonomy. Instead, I walked toward him, my heart a frantic bird hitting my ribs until I was close enough to feel the slow, controlled exhale that always signaled his dangerous focus. I reached out, not with the drunken bravado of the night we met, but with a trembling, unspoken desire that terrified me more than his rivals. My hand stopped just short of his strong, defined chest. "You can't just own me, Hayen," I whispered, the words a breathless shadow in the quiet room. He turned then, his presence an embrace that didn't require a touch, his stare so intense I almost forgot to breathe. He was a man who controls danger, and in that moment the danger was the traitorous spark leaping between us. His hand rose, his fingers hovering near the line of my throat, taking in every breath I took. He was the protector and the jailer, a man who didn't do random and never let go. "I don't just own you, Arya," he replied, his voice a low, melodic rasp that made my stomach flip for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "I am responsible for you." The power imbalance was a chasm, yet as he leaned in, his eyes studying me like a target he finally intended to hit, I realized the forbidden attraction was the only thing more lethal than his enemies. The air in the study was thick with the scent of old leather, and the cold, metallic tang of the lethal authority, Hayen usually reserved for the shadows. I stood behind the heavy oak door, my heart a frantic bird beating against my ribs as I listened to the muffled, urgent tones of Nick, Hayen's second-in-command. The words weakness and soft drifted through the wood like a death sentence, each syllable a pressurized void that threatened to collapse the fragile world we had built in the mountains. Nick was blunt. The rival group was watching, and Hayen's obsession with my safety was being read as a fracture in his iron-fisted rule. I felt a strange awareness of the power imbalance that defined us. I was the good weakness that could bring a multi-billion-dollar hotel empire to its knees. When the door finally opened, Hayen didn't see me at first. He stood with his back to me, his strong, defined shoulders rigid, his jaw sharp with a tension that felt lethal. He was a man who controls danger, and I could see him recalibrating, shifting back into the untouchable predator who didn't do random. He turned, and for a split second his eyes, a deep, unreadable brown, flared with a traitorous spark of the unspoken desire we had shared the night before. But then the shutters came down. His expression became focused, unreadable, and too calm, the kind of calm that preceded an execution. He told me he had urgent decision to make in the city, and that I was to remain in the restricted suite with double the guard. I wanted to reach out, to challenge the golden cage he was reinforcing, but the terrifying, absolute stillness in his gaze stopped my tongue. He was preparing to prove his ruthlessness to the world, to erase the stain of his humanity, all while keeping me from seeing his true nature. As he walked past me, his slow, controlled exhale felt like a goodbye to the man I thought I was beginning to know. I was the bait, and he was the hunter, and as the gates of the fortress of silk hissed shut, I realized that to save me, he was willing to become the monster I feared most. The ballroom was a shimmering den of knives, a place where the light from the crystal chandeliers didn't illuminate the room so much as it sharpened the edges of everyone inside. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, my defiant spirit draped in a floor-length gown of midnight silk that felt more like a golden cage than a dress. Hayen stood beside me, his lethal authority radiating from him in a pressurized void that made the elite of soul keep their distance. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at me, his eyes, a deep, unreadable brown, tracing the line of my throat with a possessive tension that made my skin hum. I was his queen for the night, a shield meant to smoke out a traitor by proving I was the one thing he valued more than his multi-billion-dollar hotel empire. The power imbalance was a physical weight between us, a reminder that I was the bait in a game of neon-lit flirtation that had turned deadly. As he led me onto the dance floor, his strong, defined hand resting on the small of my back, I felt the unspoken desire flare like a traitorous spark. I knew I was being used, that my presence was a calculated power moved to draw out rival family assassins, yet beneath the paralyzing fear, I found a strange, grounding spark that had nothing to do with fear. I looked into his focused, unreadable gaze and realized that I trust the man holding the blade more than the shadows circling us. He leaned in, his slow, controlled exhale brushing against my ear as he whispered a warning I barely heard over the phantom heartbeat in my chest. He was a man who controls danger, and as he spun me into the center of the kill zone, I realized I wasn't afraid of the knives in the dark. I was afraid of how much I wanted to stay in the arms of the man who wielded them. The cold metal of a burner phone pressed against my palm, a pressurized void vibrating with the ultimatum of Hayen's enemies. They had my brother, a bargaining chip intended to turn the good weakness into a lethal traitor. My heart was a frantic bird, hitting the bars of my ribs as the voice on the other end demanded the access codes to Hayen's private casinos in exchange for my family's safety. It was the ultimate test of the power imbalance that defined us. Save the blood that raised me or protect the man who had turned my life into a golden cage. I stood in the silent library of the Fortress of Silk, staring at Hayen's silhouette against the moonlight. He looked untouchable, his jaw sharp and his lethal authority undisturbed by the betrayal brewing in my hands. I thought of my old life, the budgets and deadlines, and the girl who took up space with loud laughter. That life was a breathless shadow now, a world that felt too small for the strange awareness I had developed in his arms. If I betrayed him, I would be free, but I would be leaving the only man who saw me as more than the bait. Beneath the paralyzing fear for my brother, a traitorous spark of absolute loyalty ignited. I realized I didn't want to go back to being a tourist in my own life. I chose the danger he controlled. I chose the den of knives. I didn't dial the rivals back with the codes. Instead, I walked toward Hayen, the burner phone heavy as a death sentence in my hand, and placed it on the desk between us. "They have my brother," I whispered, my voice a low melodic rasp that didn't waver. I saw his eyes, a deep, unreadable brown, flare with a focused, unreadable intensity as he realized I was handing him my soul. In that moment, I stopped being his prisoner and became his most unexpected ally. I trusted the man holding the blade to help me save my family, and in return, I committed fully to his dark world. The unspoken desire was no longer a secret. It was a calculated power that made us both lethal. The aftermath of the war tasted like ozone and cold iron, a lingering scent that even the most expensive floral arrangements in the Grand Seoul Ballroom couldn't quite mask. I stood at Hayen's side, my hand resting on his forearm, feeling the strong, defined muscle beneath the black silk of his sleeve. The room was a den of knives no longer. The rivals had been dismantled, their names erased from the city's ledger in a violent reckoning that had left Hayen's lethal authority absolute. Tonight was the final emotional reckoning, a public declaration that would shift the power imbalance of the entire syndicate. As I looked out at the sea of bowed heads and wary eyes, I realized the golden cage had expanded to encompass the horizon, and I was no longer a tourist caught in its bars. I was the one holding the key. Hayen, stare was so intense as he turned toward me, his eyes a deep, unreadable brown, reflecting a focused, unreadable pride that made my stomach flip for reasons that had nothing to do with the paralyzing fear of the past weeks. He didn't just look at me. He studied every breath I took, as if confirming that his most unexpected ally was truly standing there by choice. The unspoken desire that had once been a traitorous spark was now an open flame, a calculated power that anchored us both in the center of the pressurized void of his world. He raised a glass, the motion a slow, controlled gesture that commanded the silence of the room, and I felt the strange awareness of my own defiant spirit merging with his lethal stillness. Arya is no longer a guest of this hotel, nor is she a liability to be protected, he declared, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence for anyone who dared to disagree. The rival family had seen her as a good weakness, a target to exploit, but Hayan was officially remapping the world. He looked back at me, his jaw sharp and his expression serious, and for the first time, the terrifying, absolute stillness in his gaze was softened by an interest that was not playful, not shy, but determined. "She is the only woman who will ever rule beside me," he said, and the words were a contract that never lets go. I leaned into his strong, defined presence, my own heart a frantic bird finally finding its perch. I had teased a mafia boss, undressed him, and climbed him like a jungle gym in a moment of drunken bravado. But the man who stood before me now was no entertainment professional. He was the king of soul, and I was the queen who had chosen the danger over the safety of a life that had always felt too small. As he leaned down to seal the claim with a kiss, I realized that trapping me and protecting me had truly become the same thing, and in his possessive tension, I had finally found my freedom.